fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Several shots were fired as President Kennedy's motorcade passed through downtown Dallas.
None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
This is Houston, say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Welcome to the Hagmann Daily Show, weekdays 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And now your hosts, Joe Hagmann and Jon Robberson.
Hello and welcome to this Friday edition of the Hagmann Daily Show. Today is February 16th, 2018. As I just dribbled some gas station coffee down my shirt. Usually I don't buy coffee from the store. I make it at home. But I was out running errands this morning and I didn't have coffee before I left, so I stopped and got some. And here I am sitting here drinking it. And I just dribbled it all over my t-shirt. So that's fun. Anyway, we got a great show for you today. We're going to... we're going to cover some news, some things that are going on that are important to talk about. And we're also going to be joined by Bob Griswold, and he's going to come on to talk about what he sees from this Florida shooting, but more importantly, situational awareness, which is something he has talked about for many years, as he is the owner of Ready Made Resources, and they sell all kinds of survival, night vision, accessories, things that you would use in water filters. It's a preparedness and survival company, ReadyMadeResources.com, and he's going to join us to talk about situational awareness and some details on this shooting, which we have learned a few interesting things more than we have yesterday to make note of, John, and I'll just rattle these off real quick. One, yesterday we talked about the red flags that were given to the FBI from his comments on his YouTube channel, saying he was a professional school shooter. The FBI said that they could not track, or that wasn't a strong enough lead to really investigate, which I think is a bunch of BS. But what we learned today is the police definitely knew about this guy, as they were called to his home 39 times since 2013. 39 times. He's putting comments on the internet about being a professional shooter. He's putting pictures on social media of him posing with weapons. He's obviously a huge disciplinary problem in school, as he was suspended for fighting threats, as well as having bullets in his backpack. And also now we learned that the police were well aware of this young man, as he was called. They were called to his house 39 times. All the red flags were there.
In addition to that, quickly, Joe, his defense team is stating on the record this morning that he suffers from some degree of autism as well as clinical depression, and his biological mother passed away from pneumonia last November, and his father is dead many years. He's essentially parentless as well.
But he was taken in by a family, and apparently he was looked after. There's no excuse, and the attorney, obviously, doing her job, quote unquote, said that he's just confused and wasn't loved enough, and all this BS that the Clarence Thomas put it really well in a victimhood culture. He talked about he decries victimhood culture. That's actually on the Daily Caller from Drudge. Clarence Thomas decries victimhood culture in rare public remarks, and that's what this attorney is playing into. Somehow everybody's a victim today, including the people who carry out mass murder. And forget those victims. It's important to make sure we coddle this young man. As the Drudge Report rightfully shows, media blames Trump. Jimmy Kimmel, another late night host, called the president mentally ill. You have people cheering on, shooting Republicans now on social media, but that's okay. No red flags there. This is just the status quo.
There's a lot of irritants. Well, first of all, in the broadest sense, there's just great sadness surrounding this story. Because at the end of the day, as we both pointed out yesterday, Joe, there are hundreds of people directly affected by the senseless death of 17 true victims.
Yeah, in the worst way.
Absolutely. And of course, there are many thousands indirectly affected with just that sense of depression and malaise and what has gone wrong in our country that we're seeing this happen over and over and over. It's becoming, a biweekly, certainly a monthly type thing. And I don't want to get too deep into this, Joe, because this article really incensed me today. And because we are blessed to have Bob Griswold joining us in the bottom of the hour, I don't have time to read this op-ed piece. Otherwise, I would. But this is from a site, Joe, that I'm not familiar with. It's antimedia, I believe, .org. And this was curated by the Daily Sheeple. Headline, "Nobody wants to admit the real reasons behind American mass shootings." And essentially, Joe, I would really encourage our listeners to check out this op-ed because on the one hand, I agreed with much of what's written in it. On the other hand, it is a scathing indictment of what this writer is calling the violent history of America, going all the way back to the country's inception. And frankly, I think this writer took some significant liberties with history. But at the same time, when you read an op-ed that sparks the emotional conflagration that it did in me here this morning, it's definitely worth taking a look at. The headline, once again, "Nobody wants to admit the real reasons behind American mass shootings." But go ahead.
And David Capellian has a great piece up on WorldNet Daily, "Media ignoring one critical factor in Florida shooting," and that is the meds. And he goes on to say, "Guns, depression, trouble cited, but key information not yet discussed." And here we go again. "A horrific mass shooting occurs. Everyone is in shock and grief. Democrats blame guns and Republicans. Pundits urge the public, if you see something, say something, and everybody asks why." And then he goes on to talk about another case, the Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook shooter, and talks about the similarities in the reports from troubled youth to he was homeschooled and whatnot, but also the medication. And this is what Keith Hansen talked about yesterday, and many refuse to talk about because apparently the medical and specifically the pharmaceutical industry, as we've talked about earlier this week, owns much of the cable media. It seems like half of the ads on cable are for medicines that you need a prescription for. You can't even go out and buy. So you have to get your doctor to give you a prescription. And what kind of twisted... We've talked about this so much, but it's worth mentioning again. What kind of twisted backward society advertises meds that doctors are supposed to prescribe to you based on your ailments? It's not supposed to be patients recommending their own medicines to doctors so they can get kickbacks. And the whole problem with the pharmaceutical industry is it only treats disease. It never cures it. But the psychoactive or SSRI type drugs, are they something that we need to look at and consider when talking about the purchase of weapons?
Joe, let me give you just a quick piece of the article I just mentioned. I want to bounce this off you and see. I really want to hear your opinion on this, but I'm just going to give you the opening. There was a mass casualty event at an American high school yesterday that took the lives of 17 students, and I'm unfortunately not surprised at this point. Mass shootings have become commonplace in America as of late, and after every one of them, the political blame game spins round and round, even before we send out our redundant thoughts and prayers. We have to ban guns. No, we need more guns. We need to put more police in public places and even in schools to deter shooters. We need to ban gun-free zones. We need to blame all right-wingers. We need to blame all left-wingers. We need to call white violence terrorism. We need to blame psychotropic drugs. We need to ban Muslims. We need to, parenthetically, insert your reactionary opinion here. Everybody thinks they know what's wrong, but it seems nobody wants to acknowledge the plainly obvious reasons behind all this violence. Violence is inherent to American identity. We'll stop there.
And John, we talk about this just about every day, only in a different context. We know that guns aren't the problem, just like when you have an increase in car accidents, cars are not the problem, it's the people who operate them. But obviously something is wrong in our society. We have a disease, we have a sickness, an infection in our society. Many will call it mental defect. Many will call it behavioral dysfunction. But at the root of it, whether people want to agree with me or not, I'm 100% convinced and believe this is true, not only because it's what the scripture in the Bible says, but it also what I can feel it. It's that evil, people have turned over to evil, and there are evil influences in this world, and this increase of evil through a number of things that are happening both in the Christian world and in the secular world are adding to and increasing this evil. And it's a spiritual battle at its core.
Amen. I know we're going to get into this a little bit, and we may need to work on this next week as well, Joe, but just to take a quick look at a couple of headlines that completely support what you just said. This from dailymail.co.uk. Florida gunman says demon voices told him how to pull off school shooting, and police reveal they were called out 39 times to his family home before his mother died last year.
John, have you ever heard voices?
Well, not in a natural birth sober state. No.
Okay, I haven't either.
I have not.
I couldn't tell you what that's like. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying I don't believe this kid, but obviously he has no credibility whatsoever. But
I agree with you.
There have been, as we talked about just before we went on air, and we're going to detail, very similar type stories as far as the voices and even and they're not just being used as excuses. You made the point about the airport, Fort Lauderdale Airport last year.
Yes, Esteban Santiago, absolutely.
A man killed 5 people. I think he injured 9 more in a shooting there. But months before that happened, he was in Alaska, and he turned himself into the FBI and said that the CIA was forcing him to join ISIS, and also talked about voices that were in his head and the control that was there trying to get him to do these things, and they let him walk out the doors.
And remember,
you gave another example too.
Yes, Aaron Alexis, the shooter from the U.S. Navy Yard in mass casualty event, 12 victims killed at the Washington, D.C. Navy Yard. Now, this was back in late 2013, and he was apparently suffering from, quote unquote, voices in his head as well. And I would add as a side note, particularly to our listeners who've been with the Hagmann Report for a long time, he carved into the buttstock of his weapon, which I believe was a 12-gauge shotgun, if memory serves. This is my ELF. But the mainstream media read that, Joe, as this is my elf. And they actually kind of made like some darkly, snidely, I don't want to say humorous remarks about this guy having a little elf friend or whatever. But of course, many of us suspect that he meant ELF, as in extreme low frequency. Now, this is a big enough topic for a whole show. But Joe, you and I both have been around long enough. We've heard this time and again. Do the powers that be, whether it's an MK Ultra thing, intelligence agencies, rogue, non-governmental, mercenary type agencies, or even just PIs that have gone rogue and are involved in the whole gang stalking type thing. Does the technology exist, Joe, to actually place voices in someone's head? A lot of people think it does.
It does. I believe it does as well. And look, we have a story. Remember the U.S. diplomats in Cuba who had suffered from sound attacks? And there's preliminary findings in U.S. diplomat health problems, still a mystery. This was came out yesterday. And it talks about they suffered brain injuries, but they did not suffer head or brain trauma as would have been expected. So there's still no indications of what may have caused the mysterious symptoms in the U.S. diplomats in Cuba. But they talk about the Journal for American Medical Association says unique circumstances of the patients raise concern about a new mechanism for possible acquired brain injury from exposure to unknown origin. And that's what they're talking about, the sound. They actually have a clip of what that sound sounds like that the U.S. diplomats would have heard, and it's really a buzzing, squeaking, humming kind of sound that you'd expect, like an electronic sound. John, remember we walked out of the studio the other day and the telephone wires were buzzing?
Yeah, yes, I do, and that was and it's reminiscent of a very strange story. I don't know the level of veracity to this story. But Joe, I know this landed front and center on your radar a year or two ago as well. Remember the story that went around about the miners? I believe they were either miners or they were some type of geology scientists in Russia who apparently dug deep enough into the earth and they recorded some very strange audio. You can find it on YouTube. And again, it kind of sounds like static and screeching. But if you listen closely, it almost does kind of sound, well, frankly, demonic.
I've heard those videos, and the big holes in the earth where people record and say that they've captured the sounds of hell. I've listened to those, and they do sound pretty evil. Who knows what their origin is? I know that the earth is full of mysteries, and we don't even know what really holds all the matter together. We know that God does it, but through what means is it done that we understand in physics or in science? Anything from electricity to sound. We know that the power of sound and vibration can make shapes, can move matter, can change things.
Yeah, what about those experiments? Sorry to cut you off, but what about the experiments that we've seen with how sound affects the formation of ice crystals in drops of water?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And, it's funny, I went and I had stopped at my mom's today, and my sister and her kids were there, my nephews, and Jake, he's 12 years old, and we've never really talked about, the government or conspiracies or anything like that, but he asked me such a weird question today. He said, Joe, do you think that the government knows the cure to cancer, but is keeping it a secret? It came out of nowhere. I was shocked that he asked
12 years old?
Yeah.
Wow. That's
I said,
very insightful.
I said, oh man, Jake, I don't have an hour to sit here and talk to you, but absolutely. I said, you do some research on it. And I told him, I said, we started to talk a little bit about the CIA, and I said, well, if you really want to know what they were capable of, 30, 40, 50 years ago, do some research into their different programs, whether it was trying to create psychic assassins, MK Ultra, that kind of stuff. There are these sciences that have been perfected over the last 30, 40 years that I definitely believe can be weaponized. And whether that's the case in this Florida shooting, I don't know. But it does seem to stem from, mental related health issues. And whether that's a schizophrenia or if it's, he was actually targeted. Who knows? Why would they target this kid? But, there's a million questions that come when we get into that discussion.
Quick question before we move forward, Joe. You made a very good point, a very passionate point in your opening remarks. We as Christians, as patriots, just as human beings, we need to have extreme discernment when some of these shooters do not take their lives ex post facto. For example, the Aurora movie theater shooter, the kid that
James
shot Gabby Giffords down in Arizona,
Lawford.
and yes, and this Nicholas Cruz who's in custody now. We know that you can even see in the optics coming out of the court appearance yesterday this phony baloney look of contrition on the defense team's faces, and you almost sense that they have like this gross empathy for someone who's a heinous criminal. But we do need, to a degree, we need to listen to what these people say motivated them to some degree. We don't want to buy it as an excuse, Joe, but maybe as more of an explanation.
Yeah, I mean, there are a million things we can blame these shootings on, but unless we actually get and address the root issues, which are and is evil, can that increase? Can that spiritual battle manifest itself in mental illness? This is an interesting topic. We don't really have time to get into it today, but if you look in Scripture, you see many examples of during Jesus' ministry, as he was moving around Israel for different reasons, he performed a number of miracles on people. And as we would read today, these people seemed mentally insane.
Absolutely. The most famous or infamous is probably is Legion. The demonized
two naked men in Matthew who the spirits were thrown into the pigs.
Yes, and the whole just the environment of being among the tombs and the demonized man says essentially, we are Legion.
Right. Inhumane strength, kept breaking the chains, was crazy, was always naked, yelling and screaming and a danger to people. That's why he was chained up in such a remote place. and Jesus would cast these spirits out, and
it's the
people
first thing he would do.
Be better. So
yeah, that's right. It was the first thing he would do as well. Remember, Jesus had 4 instructions to the disciples, and the first one was to cast out the spirits in his name before healing the sickness, before laying hands, before ministering, evangelizing, etc.
Yeah, absolutely right. And, is modern psychology, has that replaced, as we've moved away from Scripture, as we moved away from being really a Christian society, has psychology and parts of modern medicine replaced spiritual, formerly spiritual areas where modern medicine really has no influence or has no cures? As we see with so many of these diseases, they can manage the symptoms like schizophrenia. As long as you take a certain medicine, you can remain a functioning member of society to some degree. But they don't have cures for this. And if we saw Jesus's ministry today with some of these people, what would he do? This is what we need to understand better. Not that we can, as far as our society has gone from Christianity, but really to study throughout history how this, I guess you'd say, how mental illness was dealt with. And many people make an argument, open the asylums back up, open the state mental institutions back up. And there are many other arguments. But as we see, and we're going to bring, again, Bob Griswold on to talk about all of this and the situational awareness. But this stuff's going to continue to happen as long as you have crazy people. And it doesn't matter if you have guns or whatever, they're legal or not, because people will make bombs or use cars or knives or hammers or bats or crossbows, create some other way to kill people. People have been killing people before guns. They will continue to kill people after there are no guns, if and when that happens. And to try, it does make it easier, okay? I mean, we can admit that, but it doesn't mean that we've had guns in this society for such a long time, and we've never had this kind of problem for hundreds of years. That's an excellent
point. Joe, I want to take 60 seconds to do some quick housekeeping, and then I'm going to ask you a question about exactly what you just said. First of all, I want to thank Angela Warren for sending me the links that she did this morning. Many of our listeners will remember Angela from early in 2017, one of the first really big advocates of protecting children when the whole Pizzagate story began to expand into what we now call Pedogate, of course, the global disaster of child trafficking. So thank you to Angela for her help this morning. Also, Stephen Minking has agreed to join us for a few minutes every Wednesday here on the Hagmann Daily Show to give us some clarity in the markets. And Joe, I know you want to take a few moments before Bob Griswold joins us to talk about the insanity that we're seeing lately in the markets. But before we go there, I want to ask you this question. I've never asked you this, but I want your personal opinion. Do you think that we need to employ different criteria or stricter criteria to determine someone's mental health prior to their ability to purchase a weapon? On the one hand, it seems like a slippery slope, but
John,
it's a tough question, isn't it?
No, it's a good question. It's a legitimate question. But when we talk about, listen to this. The one thing that I found out is that the last few shootings that happened, the church shooting, and there was another one. I'll have to get my notes because I do have it written down. But it was a background check that failed. The shooter in Sutherland Springs was dishonorably discharged from the military for assaulting his wife and their baby, apparently, if I remember correctly. And he was never supposed to be able to buy a gun. That was a background check that failed, that led to him being able to purchase a gun. And there was a shooting right before that. It wasn't the Vegas shooting, but one of the ones that just happened recently where the background check failed. I believe the background check here failed, in part due to the lack of the FBI following up on that threat on YouTube, and then him being expelled from school and having the police come to his house 40 times in the last 5 years. I think before any purchase went through, something should have been, somebody, maybe multiple agencies, should have been flagged and consulted before the sale of that gun was allowed to go through because of the trouble. There needs to be more layers, John, yes, but who regulates them? What are the rules? That's where you get into murky ground.
Yes,
because
and how
you're stepping on freedoms.
That's right. How do we keep the political left in this country, who are these rabid, almost mindless gun grabbers. They're
Right.
See,
And
to
look,
me,
John,
it's
what that does,
reactionary. But please go ahead.
no, what that does is make the right the way they are, saying, well, if you want to ban assault weapons or AR-15s, that's part of the slippery slope, to take all our guns. So no, we're not just going to ban guns, a blanket ban on guns, because we know how you liberals are. You'll never be happy until, every last gun, or at least until every last law-abiding citizen's gun is gone. So when you see this political battle, you have two extremes. You have the gun grabbers and no, don't ever touch any of my guns, which both are probably wrong.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Joe, because I know in California, and I think this, and we'll ask Bob Griswold because he knows a lot about Second Amendment issues. Interestingly, his name and his company are mentioned in one of my favorite prepper books of all times, the second in the Patriot series by James Wesley Rawls, Survivors, which is a phenomenal book. But anyway, we're looking forward to having him on. I agree with you, Joe, in the sense that in California, when you purchase a firearm, you have to answer 10 questions. And I know that this questionnaire, it's a 4-page thing, goes directly to the ATF while you're actually standing at the firearm vendor, at the counter. And one of the questions asks if you've been committed against your will to a mental institution. And that's the key caveat. Yeah, the key is if you've willingly gone into, for example, detox, rehabilitation, etc., that does not prevent or preclude you from purchasing the weapon. However, if you've been involuntarily committed, then it, in most cases, does.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, John. And this is as we just talked about, especially on the heels of the shooting, the bodies have not even been buried yet. I believe the first funeral for a 14-year-old girl is happening today. And what
just breaks my heart, man.
It is. It's heartbreaking. And then what dehumanizes it and makes it so terrible, for even worse, is the politicalization of the events. And when you see, the CNN host asking the students, do you think Donald Trump should ban guns? Things like that. It infuriates both the left and the right, because the left wants all guns banned. The right is so sick and tired of the left and their lies, their insanity, their incessant ruining and trying to take of everything. And really, I would say, if all the ideologies, the communism, the left, the extreme left that we see in our country today is at the core of this godless, immoral promotion of abortion and transgenderism and all this depravity. That ideology is part of the root cause of this. If we're looking at spiritual disorders, John, but
isn't it interesting, Joe? In 1962, we kicked prayer. Essentially, we kicked submission and presenting oneself to the throne. Literally, we kicked it out of school in 1962. A famous case in New York. And look at what's happened here 50 years later. We have today a 14-year-old girl whose life was cut significantly short. Where? At school, of all places. I mean, is that cause and effect? Is that a setup and a payoff, or what?
Yeah, it's really infuriating to have to sit through this, to listen to the victims as you hear press conference and vigil and people speaking out, and it's we go through this all too often, and I'm sure we'll continue to go through this in the future, as this partisan fight will lead nowhere, and unless people are able to put their identity politics aside and sit down and really try. I don't know that any solution is out there, but we're never going to make any progress with the way things are and the divide that we have and the extremes that we have in this country today. There's a new article from Yahoo on this shooter, John, and I'm going to bring Bob Griswold on. It says, FBI says a person contacted agency with concerns about suspect Florida school shooter, but it failed to investigate. And this is a news story. It's only one sentence long from the AP here on Yahoo News.
Boy, that's brevity.
But yeah, it's apparently different from the YouTube thing. Or maybe it isn't. I don't know. But if you go on the front of Judge John, it's in red, FBI botched. And I only get one sentence, so I don't know what that's about. But
you know what? I want to make one final comment before we welcome. I believe this is Bob's first time joining us on the Hagmann Daily Show.
Yes.
But before we bring Bob in, I think I figured out what incensed me so significantly about that op-ed that I opened with today, Joe. To call America an inherently violent nation or people is totally antithetical to what we know is our immediate Christian roots from the moment the original Pilgrims stepped off Mayflower. And of course, without getting into a deep history lesson, what was that? November 11th, 1620, I believe. The Mayflower Compact says, as we step forth on this new land, may every step we take be in the name of Christ. I'm paraphrasing, but that's
thing with George Washington dedicating the nation to God at the church downtown that wasn't destroyed on September 11th. I forget the name of the church, very famous church where Jonathan Cahn wrote about the book, the Harbinger. Where the tree was taken down, and it had a very similar prophetic meaning in Scripture. We'll have to revisit that as we move forward here, John. But we have with us Robert Griswold. He is the founder and owner of Ready Made Resources, and that's readymaderesources.com, and it's a one-stop shop for all your prep survival type needs, from water filters to night vision goggles and everything in between. And he has come on the Hagmann Report in the past to talk about situational awareness, and we want to get his take on this latest shooting from the law enforcement perspective, from the media perspective, as well as from situational awareness perspective. Mr. Griswold, welcome to the Hagmann Daily Show.
It's good to be here, sir. Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's great to have you.
First of all, welcome. Again, just a pleasure to be here. Again, we see too many of these situations where we have children losing their lives. It is, as a father, it is a very grieving thing to realize that there are 17 families, 17, there's grandparents, parents, uncles, nephews that have lost a loved one. It really is a thing that we need as a nation to address, and not with just some Band-Aid solution. There are deep systemic problems that are causing these things. And unless we address these issues, they will not get resolved. But again, at the same time, whether we will address them or not, I have doubts about. But there are things the individual can do to help put themselves in a position that if they are in a situation where there is an active shooter, they can increase their chances to survive. And so that's what we want to do. We really do want to offer the prayers for people who have lost their loved ones. But more than that, we want to give people the knowledge of how to survive an active shooter situation and take charge and not let fear rule the day, where they just become immobilized with fear. There are things that you can do.
Yeah, there are. And right before we brought you on, Bob, I was talking about an article that was on the front of Drudge, how FBI botched this. And I found out what that means, John. Apparently, the Fox News and others are reporting that somebody who knew Cruz, who was close to Cruz, called an FBI tip line before this happened to warn them that this was going to happen. So there's even more layers on top of the FBI knowing this person's name, talking about he wanted to be a professional school shooter months before, and was even notified of that the day after he made that comment, was then able to buy a gun, and apparently was reported on by somebody else close to him directly to the FBI. So when we hear that Sheriff Israel say, when we see something, say something, he's absolutely right. But when you say something and nothing is done about it, those failures are directly on law enforcement.
Absolutely. Let me interject quickly. Bob, for our listeners who have not heard you join us many times over recent years on our evening program, just take a quick moment to introduce yourself and kind of give our listeners an idea of some of your bona fides and experience, and that will better enable them to understand that you are indeed someone who can put some definitive tools in everyone's toolbox today, and perhaps even save some lives.
Well, I started Ready Made Resources back in 1995. I started with a passion because I realized as a Christian person, our nation was heading down a path towards increasing levels of national sin. And as we see it throughout history, nations that commit sin against the Almighty, that violate his laws, God brings judgment on those nations. Now, it's 20 years down the road from there, and the amount of sin that our nation is allowing to be practiced in this country without anybody saying anything, especially the church, is staggering. What we see going on today, it's a wonder we don't have more of these things. But with that said, I have been an individual, a person who's prepared for the last 20 some years. We've run our business with a passion of educating people on how to survive. I did spend about 15 years as a contractor overseas, doing various works, which I'm not going to talk too much about. But it did put me in a lot of situations where situational awareness was absolutely crucial. You had to know what is going on around you. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East and in Asia. I've been to pretty much every country in the Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, and then the Asian countries as well, China, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur. I mean, you name it, Japan. I've been there, throughout Europe. So you do learn that if you're going to be in any way, in any kind of capacity like that, you better learn to take care of yourself and to know what's going on around you, because failure to do so can have very grave consequences to it.
And right, from what you say, what these students went through, they went through a fire drill that morning, and then another fire alarm was pulled, and many students right there said that's when they knew something wasn't right. But other students, didn't think twice, I'm sure, before going outside or even listening to orders from teachers or even the principal to evacuate. And
it's
just so important to pay attention to the details.
It's in a mindset. We have to develop a mindset in this country that says, I will pay attention to my environment and to my surroundings. I am responsible, even though there are, different layers of support that go on to alert us to situations. Ultimately, I'm responsible. They say in the World Trade Center, 75% of the people sit there and wait to be told what to do. You've had a plane crash into the building and they wait being told what to do. There are people that will, even though if a plane makes an emergency landing and it's on fire, will sit there and wait with their seatbelt buckled to them and wait to be told what to do. 15% of the people you have to be prepared for, because they are going to lose it. They are going to be, they're going to be screaming, the sky is falling, we're all going to die, and they're going to panic everyone. Only about 10% of people will sit there and rationally think through the situation. Again, if I get on an airplane, if I go to the mall, if I'm in any building, I know where my exits are at. My son and I run these drills. If we're walking through a building, I know I keep an active mental note of where the exits are at. So if you're at a school, wherever you're at, if you're going from class to class, you need to know how to evacuate that building quickly. People, they can make all kinds of plans and put evacuation paths on the wall. But unless you take the personal responsibility of keeping mental notes on how to do this, when these type of things arise, you are going to have to make quick mental adjustments that you might not be able to do because you could be the one under fire. So it's so important that wherever you're at, to keep those mental notes of where those exits are at. Keep your eyes open for these types of things. If they said this guy, they knew that he was mentally unstable. And so if you see someone like that showing up, or if you see someone showing up that are making odd body movements or whatever, signatures, if they're wearing clothes that are inappropriate for the season, if they're carrying backpacks, you start to make mental notes of these things. And so when you do that and these things do come about, you are able to act quickly. One of the key things is anybody who's a shooter, I know so many people go to a class and they shoot some paper targets, they get their concealed carry permit, but in an active shooter situation, if you ever try to shoot moving targets, it's a lot more difficult, especially if it's a handgun. It's very difficult to shoot a target 25 yards away that's running. It sounds, anybody who does it knows what I'm talking about. So, the thing is, if you're in these situations, is just don't stand there. Move, get moving, because again, you present a moving target, which is a lot harder to hit. Again, on top of that, knowing your exit so you can get out of that building quickly. That those are so important to do. But, what they want to do, they want to herd everybody into classrooms. And that is that is the worst thing that you can do. You want to get out of the building, get out of the ability for that man or that person or people to have access to you with their rifle. Get out of there. So those are just some of the things you do. This is trained behavior. What I do, there's an exercise I tell people all the time that they can do. You can do it tonight in your home. Get a movie. You want to get an action movie? Fine. Get whatever movie you want to get. And have two people. One of them's watching the movie. One of them's taking notes. The person who's watching the movie is supposed to be looking for what you're not supposed to see. Granted, if it's an action movie, there's two guys in the middle beating each other up. If it's a romance movie, you've got a guy and a girl kissing each other, whatever it is. But pay attention to the background scenario in that movie. And then the person who is, taking notes, they'll take notes and then question you about the background in that movie, what you saw and what you didn't see. In the background, you can see shadows. You can tell the time of the day, cars, clothes, colors. It develops a situational awareness in you, and you cannot do this on a dime. This has to be a trained behavior that takes time to do it. You can start now, but, wherever we go, I've done it to my wife when we're driving down the highway. I flick the rearview mirror out of the way and say, what color car is behind us? You want to develop that thing of knowing who's behind you and around you. You can start doing that today. And in these situations where you have to make instant split-second decisions, this can save your life. And
Bob,
besides,
let me ask you something. Let's hit pause, because I know you're a parent. You're suggesting that as of right now, as soon as our listeners hear your instructions, they can begin as adults, but also as parent to child, to initiate this training right away, simply by what we call keeping one's head on a swivel. Bob, can I ask you to focus a little bit from a parent's point of view? How do you instruct your young children, especially with all these school shootings happening, without freaking the youngster out? How does a parent go about doing it properly?
Well, again, I think children, I don't want to go snowflake. I think children can handle a lot more than what we give them credit to. If we don't want to pamper a child. You can't afford to pamper a child in a war zone. If you do, you have to weigh the thing of saying whatever psychological trauma they'll suffer, if any, from thinking about these things, versus what happens if they don't think about them and they're at that situation, and then the child gets shot, injured, or dead. So you have some decisions to make as a parent. What is your child?
Did we lose Bob?
Joe, I think we may have lost Bob Griswold. Let's try to
we'll get him back.
Reconnect. I got to tell you, I'm taking notes, and I'm really encouraged that this is something that people can initiate and begin to do right away. And I want to just mention quickly, Joe, Eric and I discussed this briefly last night. A good friend of the Hagmann Report, Pastor Mike Spalding, developed an active shooter instruction sheet. It's a guideline that he uses as the senior pastor of Calvary Chapel in Lima, Ohio. And what we're going to do, Joe, is we're going to post that at HagmannReport.com. I believe Eric's going to do it this afternoon. So there will be an actual written tool, again, provided by Pastor Mike Spalding, that he uses with his church in Lima, Ohio. So look for that at HagmannReport.com.
Absolutely will. And we're calling Bob back, and we'll see if we can get him back on. But as we are waiting, this is a story I'm posting on HagmannReport.com. FBI got a tip on Parkland shooter Nicholas Cruz in January, but didn't follow up. Less than 6 weeks. Hey, Bob, we got you back. Okay. You dropped off there mid-sentence. So.
Don't know what happened, but anyhow, I think it's just training our children. I think the children can handle a lot more than what they are what we think they're capable of, especially if we make it sort of like a fact that it's making them a better person to be situational aware. The tools that they learn in being situational will serve them in their entire life. It's just good sense to do it. And so that's what we do. And again, like just little things. My son and I, if we're at the mall or a gathering like that, I say, Joshua, where are the exits? Know your exits. Know how to get out of this building. Because if you do, well, everybody else is panicked for those first 30 seconds. You're on your way out. You're going to beat the crowd, and you're going to have a much higher incident of survival. So that's how I deal with my children, and I would recommend parents do the same thing. It doesn't have to be traumatic.
Right. Absolutely. And as you said, children can handle a lot more than what most people give them credit for, and that's evident even from watching some of these interviews of the freshmen to seniors who went through this ordeal and are on the news talking about it. You always think, oh, they're children, but when you hear them talk, they understand a lot more than what people get them credit for. And even, Bob, I was talking about my nephew, my 12-year-old nephew today, out of nowhere. Never had a conversation like this with him. He asked me if I thought the government was hiding a cure for cancer. And noticing the technology seems to be much more advanced, except in certain areas. And I just thought that was pretty crazy. But yeah, I mean, it is so important. Little things, like you said, knowing where your exits are, knowing what's going on around you. If people are out of place or their dress is out of place, we see that. You see, it's not like somebody who's wearing shorts in the winter. It's somebody who's wearing a trench coat in the middle of summer. It is, and there are much more things that go with situational awareness. I remember last time you were on with us, Bob, you talked about, even when you're outside, looking at different things you can use to see behind you, behind a window, a building's glass, right?
Glass is absolutely, it is your friend. I'm telling you how many times I used it to see what was, my cell phone, my cell phone. I use it if I'm in the gym or something, and I'm on the treadmill, I can see who's behind me because it's a reflective surface. I use glass everywhere, knowing that it allows me to see what's going on behind me. So it's something.
I'm sorry, Bob, finish your thought.
No, it's just something we can train our children, we can do ourselves, and
He must have
did we lose Bob again?
Connection. Yeah, I think
indeed. It sounds like it's pretty busy on ready-made resources side today. But Joe, Bob mentioned something that made me remember a technique that I've used with great success when in a suburban or urban environment, particularly when you're walking down a sidewalk. In San Francisco many years ago, sometimes you would get a sense that there's somebody behind you that something's just not right. And I think all of us have that. You get that weird sense that you're uncomfortable with something that you cannot see. Now, in urban environments, a lot of times the simple act of turning around, physically turning around, can actually antagonize someone, particularly if they're intoxicated or having a psychotic episode. What I used to do is take off my sunglasses, put my hand behind the lens, and then put it up in front of my face like a rear view mirror. And it just looks like you're kind of quote unquote checking your look, so to speak. But in reality, by making your sunglasses a reflective surface, you're effectively giving yourself a rear view mirror without appearing to be unduly concerned with whoever may be behind you. It was actually a pretty good technique.
Absolutely. John, I hate to do this, but we have some breaking news that just shot across my desk here. Wow, listen to this. Okay, Robert Mueller indicts the Russians. Robert Mueller Russians indicted in special counsel's probe for operations allegedly supporting Trump in an election.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
The special counsel's office said Friday that a federal grand jury indicted 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian entities in a probe into interference in the 2016 elections. The indictment says the defendants allegedly, by early to mid-2016, were supporting the presidential campaign of then-candidate Donald Trump and disparaging Hillary Clinton. Oh, man, there's not much more to this story. There is an indictment out online. It's 37 pages. Obviously, I will be posting this on the Hagmann Report as well. So, I don't know what to say, John.
Well, hashtag I am not a bot. Joe, this is something obviously we're going to have to unpack over the weekend and bring some succinct reporting to on Monday. But just to reflect quickly on what our guest Bob Griswold was saying, And I really like this. Joe, we've talked about this 1,000 times. I really like to provide tools that people can use for whatever situation or circumstance. And it reminds me of a book that people can probably get for $1 nowadays because it's 10 years old. But there's a great book called Deep Survival: Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why, by Dr. Lawrence Gonzalez. And I think I've mentioned the book once before on the Hagmann Daily Show. But what the book demonstrates through numerous stories of people who have survived everything from shipwrecks to plane crashes is exactly what Bob Griswold was talking about. And here's a good quick example. When you get on an airplane next time, look at what the people around you begin doing. They take off their shoes, they recline their chair, they do not look at the brochure in the pocket that's provided to demonstrate where the exits are. They don't listen to the safety advice given by the flight attendants. They put themselves, if you could argue, Joe, in the most vulnerable state possible. They're shoeless. They're not paying attention. And in addition to that, I think one of the worst things that detracts from situational awareness is this constant obsession with staring at our iPhone screens.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
No good. And Bob, we have you back. I don't
know.
Yeah,
that was the next thing I was going to mention about the iPhone is kids just stuck their head in them things. You go to the gym and just watch the children in the children's area, and they're just, all of them have their heads glued into those things. And what horrible training that is for children. So,
how do you break children on this? We saw the video of the child on the plane, and they said it was from him not having an iPad. He was screaming for 8 hours. Is it something we need to be very conscious of and keep the screens away from our kids till a certain age and make sure we regulate their use of certain technologies?
We just never allowed our children to have them. I mean, I might be an anachronism, but I would never allow my children to have those things. I think they're very detrimental to the development of a child's mind to begin with. And the programming, a lot of times that goes on in their mind with these video games, I think can really cause long-term damage. I mean, let's face it, guns are not the problem in this situation. We have a absolutely broken family situation. We have children that are brought into these public education systems where they're told that there is no God. And I've challenged people over and over again. Tell me why it is wrong to murder if there are no such thing as transcendent values. The lion doesn't feel guilty after eating a sheep. He's just looking for another sheep to eat. So, it's a systemic failure throughout our system of children. And as parents, we're going to have to start taking this role back and saying it is my job to educate my children, my job to give them the religious and academic training. And I think as we do that, we start rescuing individual children one by one. But again, I've never let my children have these video games. I think they're extremely dangerous and damaging to the child. And if your child's addicted to them, you're going to have to figure out how to go about and break them away from it.
Might take a lot of actual behavior and activity behavior, doing stuff, taking them to the beach or horseback riding or whatever it is that you can find that they can do outside of that, even if it's playing board games at home or something like that. There are many things that can be done to break those habits. Nothing is impossible. And maybe just like drug addiction, you're going to have issues and battles in that quitting of that whatever the substance is. So it's gonna be similar to that in removing children from the screen addictions that they have. Bob, we only have a few minutes left. I want to thank you for coming on. ReadyMadeResources.com is the website. You got any specials, anything going on that you want to talk about?
Well, yeah, again, we strongly still think that America is headed for a very dangerous time in history, and we recommend people get ready. Don't stop your preparations. We specialize in equipping people for being able to be ready at night with night vision devices, which I'll be glad to discuss with anybody about. We do offer financing on them because they are a pricey thing. And the other thing I tell people is the communication. It is one of the 3 C's of military doctrine, communication. And, today we have the ability to access ham radio, which gives us the ability to communicate over long distances, up to maybe 50 to 100 miles easily with a handheld radio. And so if the communication systems in this country go down, those that have the ability with ham radio are going to do very well versus those without it. And those that can see at night and see what's going on at night are going to do very well compared to those without it. My 800 number, I'm glad to talk to people. It's 800-627-3809. I will give you my best consultation. I don't charge for it. So anybody wants to call, do that. We do have a special right now that anybody who buys one of our radio packages, our Anytone radio package, we're going to throw in 2 free Bofang radios free. That means you'll have 4 radios. So if somebody comes along that's a friend and something's happened, you can actually give them one of these radios to you. So we're giving 2 radios away free with any of our radio packages.
Well, that's awesome. And Bob, thank you so much for coming on. I don't know what that echo
Can we have that number one more time, please, Bob? The consultation is so valuable, and I know you spend an awful lot of time one-on-one with your customers. What's the number again?
It's 800-627-3809. I do know people that have my qualifications charge up $200 an hour for consultation. I don't charge anything. I'm glad to talk with you about your needs, and I promise you I won't pressure you to buy something. I'll present to you what's needed and what's available, and then let you make the decision.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and it was great having you on, and I know we got to get you scheduled to come on sometime on the Hagmann Report, and we will definitely have you back sometime in the future on this show.
Thank you, and God bless.
God bless you too. We
God
only
bless,
have
Bob.
a
Thank you.
few moments left on this show. Want to, again, before we sign off for the week, as it is Friday, and I don't know, John, maybe if anything crazy happens over the weekend, we can probably do a show. But we have a few other things going on this weekend. I'll be on Dave Hodges this Sunday at 8 o'clock, I believe. So wanted to mention that. Also, don't forget, simplycleanfoods.net is our sponsor. They're a veteran Christian-owned company. Their slogan, never throw away food again. The GMO-free, 1 ingredient in the food, and they have packs that you can get the food without money up front or create a monthly payment plan. It's a great product as well. And John, real quick, I know Dr. Ted Brewer's on tonight, but last night on Hagmann Report, we had Bill Gertz on, and that was a great grab. And next week, we have Leo Holman from Gateway Pundit coming on. Is that correct?
Jim Hoft, the editor-in-chief. Yes,
Holman?
Yeah, we had Leo on, I believe it was earlier this week. But I just want to reiterate, my favorite thing about our new sponsor, Joe, is what you just said. How many ingredients are in a can of raspberries?
1 ingredient.
Amen.
Yeah, so check that out, simplycleanfoods.net. And we're going to be throwing some of these shows up on YouTube, but if you're listening to this on the podcast and whatnot, I guess that doesn't matter. But the 2 interesting pieces of news that we mentioned today. 1, the FBI was called in January by a person close to the shooter in the school shooting, the deadliest school shooting in American history, I might add. And this was called into the FBI tip line, but the FBI botched it. The second time they botched a lead in this investigation before it actually turned into a murder. Now, also, Robert Mueller indicts 16 Russians. As I said when we mentioned it, I don't know what this is about. From what I read, 5 counts of aggravated identity theft are among the charges, and I don't know what distincts identity theft from aggravated identity theft, but 3 entities and a number of Russians have been indicted by Robert Mueller in support of President Trump for some reason and disparaging Hillary Clinton. Kind of a psycho story. I don't know what to make of this. And I'm sure we'll hear all the angles before we come back on Monday. So, John, it was a great week, and we'll be back next week.
The Hagmann Daily Show is brought to you by the Hagmann Report. Tune in to the Hagmann Report weekdays, 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, go to HagmannReport.com. That's HagmannReport.com.